Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and this is basically a libertarianism not a nutshell, libertarianism in-depth video. I'm not going to go over everything about every libertarian ever said, but we are going to go over many libertarian arguments, addressing many libertarian criticisms as much as possible as I can in the next 20 minutes. So first off, let's just kind of get what libertarianism is in a nutshell. So one, libertarianism is just the idea that we all own ourselves. So basically, which is, the point is you got to kind of start somewhere. And self-ownership is a good place to start because I think we can all agree the idea is that no one should own another. So if you're against slavery, then self-ownership is a great place to start. So the idea is that if I own myself, I own my life. So no one else has the right to take my life. You own your body. No one else has the right to desecrate or violate my body without my or do anything to my body, even be nice to it without my consent. Okay, so you can't just pat me on the back and be like, "Well, I thought it was a nice thing to do." And basically, through the use of my life and body, I attain property. I basically, there has to be a system of property rights because there's not an unlimited amount of stuff in the world, and basically that cup of water on the table, we have to have a system by which we determine who has the right to drink that cup of water, because if not, then everyone will just grab a rock and fight over that cup of water. So the system of property rights kind of oftentimes keys off that self-ownership, the idea that if I use my life and body, if I own that and then I use that, so let's say I take something from the ground and I make it into a cup, well, who should have the right to that cup? Well, who did it first? My body, my life was the first to do anything with this cup. What's referred to as homesteaded the cup, and that is why that cup is sort of rightfully mine. No one else has a senior claim. No one else can say, "Hey, I got to the cup first." Now, then this always raises the criticism that, hey, over time, there's less land, there's less this, there's less that. So what happens to all the new people who didn't get there in time to be the first one to claim something? Well, this is where there's not being the first one there isn't the only way to get property. You can do it by exchanging things. And the one thing you always have that's always yours is your labor. So this is why oftentimes in our early stages in life, we trade our labor for goods and services. We trade our ability to work. And then again, that ability to work can come in different favors because of the things that we know, because of our physical abilities, our faculties. That labor we can use to exchange for goods and then accumulate wealth from there through investment and through exchange. And then again, the relative value of different things become a lot less. Sort of like what you can do with a acre of land is a lot different than what you could do with an acre of land 100 years ago. So also just sort of the relative need and value of things changes a bit over time. So that's generally one way to think that through. So to recap, I own myself, I own my life and body property, and I own my property. So in that case, no one has a right to take my life, body, or property. That's essentially philosophically what libertarianism is. But there's also a lot of practical reasons, because the implication here is that we should all be free to exchange as we see fit. We should all be free to live as we see fit. And that means all social arrangements, who you love, who you form a household with, how you form a household, how does a community organize itself? All these things are to be based on sort of how we choose, how we voluntarily, how we consensually decide to organize. Same thing with how we exchange goods and services, our economies, etc. Everything is based on consent. And that has a tremendous practical value to it. So if you were to take a look at a romantic relationship, you have, different partners who want to be with each other, because they feel like they get something out of it. There's something they enjoy out of being part of that relationship. And since they are both consenting to this relationship, long as they both feel like they're getting that out of it, they'll continue to maintain this relationship. This creates an incentive on both parties to continue to provide value for each other, to do better by each other. Now, it doesn't mean that it's all going to be perfect. So if one party really, really goes out of their way to not provide value to the other, to the point where the person decides to withdraw consent, they have that mechanism. They have the ability to withdraw consent that holds them accountable. Okay, oftentimes when you take a look at like arranged marriages or situations where consent is taken out, this is where you start seeing more abuses, less willingness to provide value occur because the other person can't withdraw consent. So the ability to withdraw consent is key to accountability. The fact that that you have that lever of accountability is what creates reciprocity, because I want you to continue consenting, I will continue providing value, and you will continue providing me value. So there's reciprocity. So you have accountability, you have reciprocity when there is consent. On top of it, you have knowledge, because whenever you consent on something, you are communicating that you value it. When I buy a cup of water, now the world knows I want water. And so basically, if someone starts a water stand, and a lot of us buy water, what do we now know? There is people value water, people want water, there is a reason to produce more of it. So in that sense, that is a good thing. You're creating knowledge, you're creating reciprocity, you're creating accountability when our arrangements are based on consent. Now, when you take consent out of it, you have less accountability, less reciprocity, and less knowledge being created. So that's why we want consent. We want free markets in as many aspects of our lives as possible. So then people will sit there and start talking about things like inequality, being like, well, there are going to be situations where these people over here make a lot more money than these people over here, or these people have much more access to certain things than people over here. And that's true. There's going to be situations, and now oftentimes inequalities can happen for a couple different reasons. So now inequality meaning just a gap between the highest and the lowest. But if we're taking a look at particularly, let's first focus on wage inequality. Now the wages of someone who is a programmer, like a computer programmer, is going to be much higher than someone who has very unskilled labor. Why? Because it takes a long time to train to be a programmer, it takes a lot of effort, and there's not many people who've undertaken that effort to be a programmer, at least not enough to satisfy the demand. So there has to be an incentive for people to take on that risk, to take on that time, to take on that effort. And that's what that higher wage is. It's an incentive. It's a signal saying, hey, we could use more of this. And the low wage of the unskilled work is like, hey, we could use less of this. So really don't do this. This is a bad choice. Try something else. And now, of course, that does require education. And not everyone's going to have necessarily the same access to the same levels of education. Although, again, education is one of those places where we don't necessarily have a free market. So when we take a look at places like cell phones, the best cell phone that's out there is an inequality between that and the worst cell phone that is out there. But what's happened, because there's a market for cell phones, innovation has occurred, and that gap between the best and worst cell phone still exists, but it's narrower over time because there's an incentive to figure out how to do that. It's called profit. And then on top of it, where that lower end has still risen. Okay, that cell phone, the worst cell phone that you can get is still a hell of a lot better than the worst cell phone you can get a few years ago, because there's an incentive at improving the product at every level. You don't have this dynamic necessarily in education, healthcare, and housing, where you have a lot more government control, so you don't have as much of that reciprocity, accountability, and knowledge being created in these areas because government's more involved. And this is why you see inequality going to be much more wider in these areas. The access of housing at the lowest level versus the highest level are much wider in these areas, because you don't necessarily have the markets that can help create and supply the demand at different levels. Now, then again, when I say there isn't a market, it doesn't mean that people can't try to produce business in these areas, but between the regulations, the taxes, the different barriers and controls on what you can do, so not end up limiting what kind of market can exist, to the point where you don't have the robust market that you would otherwise have with a variety of options. And again, take a look at literally anything else that isn't treated the same way. You have, again, there's always going to be sort of a high end and a low end. The question is, does a low end really have to be that bad? Can it get better over time? Yes, when you have markets based on consent, when you have social and economic relationships based on consent. Okay, but even if you don't agree with all that, there's a reason why you would want to limit the power of government for several reasons. Okay, First is just the nature of politics. The nature of politics is polarization. The nature of politics is to divide us. Because to win an election, you only need 51%. Okay? While in markets, in enterprise, every purchase matters. Every purchase has a value. While in elections, every vote beyond 51% really provides me with no value. I've already won. So in that case, trying to have a message that gets me 100% of the vote is of no value when I can have a message that much more easily gets me 51%. And the best way to get 51% of the vote, because you can take a look at the behavioral science, people are going to be much more scared or much more compelled or much more moved by the thought of losing something than the thought of gaining something. So a message of fear, hate, and resentment towards somebody else, framing them as someone who wants to take something away, whether it's the people who are not you, whether they're the richer people who want to take stuff from you, whether they're the outsiders who want to take stuff from you. That sort of framing, to sit there and convince 51% of the people to vote in fear of the other 49% is what you get in electoral politics. So then what happens is that you just have these two sides creating greater fear, greater polarization in society, and that dismantles any kind of market because we're further apart from each other. That dismantles our families, our communities, because we're no longer communicating, associating with each other, because we're just that much more divided because of the effect of electoral politics. And the reason people are listening to the messages of fear, hate, and resentment in politics so much is because government's gotten so powerful that elections have become that much more consequential. So the more consequential politics becomes, the more consequential government is, the more the message of polarization affects you and creates this big kerfuffle. So that's one reason, so polarization. But there's also the thing is that even if you had nice politicians, the problem is when you vote for a politician, there's maybe 10 different issues that they're going to affect, and you're not going to find a politician that's right on all 10 things. Well, when I go buy a cell phone, all I care about is this is a good cell phone. Then separately, I'll go buy myself a good head of lettuce. Separately, I go buy a good TV. Every decision, every consensual arrangement is done on that specific thing. Okay, so I don't have to give up something else. While in politics, you oftentimes have to say, you know what, I really care about education, so I know this person's really bad on foreign policy, but I'm going to vote for them because they're good on education. So the end consensus is not oftentimes really representative of what people as a median believe in, because they're not voting, let's say, per issue or per thing. They're voting for a person that's a mixed bag of these things. And this is at many different levels of government. And the problem is the politics, since they're running all these things, if you're running education, foreign policy, housing policy, all these things, even if you do one thing well, you may do the other things poorly. The government ends up constantly schizophrenically rearranging its priorities based on who's in charge, who's constantly changing, making it not really effectively doing any of it. So it's kind of like the whole idea that if you do too much, you do little well. And that's what happens with government. The more powerful it gets, the more different areas that it's involved in. Also, generally, more powerful institutions are going to attract people who have the highest benefit from controlling them, which are generally not going to be the people with the most altruistic or unselfless desires. Everyone's going to want to use that power to give them more benefit. So you're generally going to attract people who are corrupt. People who are going to get the most funding from any side are going to be the most corrupt. And also when politics makes decisions, it's not always based on merit, but oftentimes based on relationships. So if you say, hey, you know what, to do this X business, you need to get a license. What's going to happen is that, you know, in general, maybe most people go through the process and get a license, but there's going to be those situations where the people who decide and approve the licenses may not like the person who applied and say, nope, they don't get a license. There may be somebody who shouldn't have gotten a license, but they're friends with the person making the decision and they get the license. So you end up having this sort of political favoritism that exists within the system. So again, you're giving room for corruption and political favoritism in every aspect of society. You're going to have such schizophrenic governance that you're not going to get effective, even if you got good people, effective anything getting done. And on top of it, you're going to have increased polarization throughout society. So larger government has a lot of costs to it, the more it gets involved in different aspects of society. So you have that, but then we also have, again, everything I said before, which is the benefits of having a society based on consent, and how markets and a world based on consent can really benefit us. Now, of course, I'm sure right now you're trying to think of a bajillion really extreme situations. Well, maybe in this situation things don't work out that great, but it's not about everything always working out perfectly. It's not about, but the idea is that long as I have my agency, long as I have the ability to make choices, there's always the opportunity of me figuring out something to make it better. It's not that everything's always going to be good, that there's not going to be that there's going to be certainty of great days ahead. But in a world of uncertainty, there is the odds of better, as much as there is the odds of worse. When you create certainty, what you have is the best you can ever expect, and even if it's the worst you'll ever have. And oftentimes when you take a look at that result of creating certainty, and oftentimes when you create certainty, you actually create worse uncertainty, because the resource is to maintain that certainty for a period of time. So let me explain what I mean. So if you sit there and say, hey, you know what, people aren't going to do better than this, and they aren't going to do worse than that, there's a cost to enforcing that, and eventually basically, if you're paying for it by taxing the rich, eventually all the rich are gone, and you're supporting the people at the bottom end. Eventually you're eroding where the money's coming from, and you are spending it more on people who are going to be a greater number at the bottom, and eventually you can't afford to provide that support anymore, because you basically economically it's just undermined. It might not happen in a generation, it might happen over a couple generations, but eventually it'll fall apart economically, and then you're going to be in a much worse situation, because now you have a whole society that was dependent on certain supports that now just literally spontaneously went away. Instead of having people develop several diverse supports at different levels in their communities, in their families, in their businesses and whatnot, that didn't all just go away at the same time, but you had a lot of smaller situations at different points in time instead of one big situation at one point in time. So sometimes trying to manufacture certainty creates a larger event of uncertainty some point in the future, instead of allowing just a general, constant, small amounts of uncertainty and small moments of uncertainty in time, and allow people to figure out how to adjust to it. So this gives you an idea of, hopefully a better idea of sort of the libertarian mindset. If you want to learn more, check out my website, libertarian101.com. There's a lot of videos on every topic where I go into this a lot more in depth, but hopefully this video kind of gives you a good holistic view of sort of the libertarian mindset and why it is a perspective that's valuable, that should be part of the political conversation, that you should be paying attention to, and hopefully even if you are not a libertarian, at least looking to libertarianism as a place to vet your ideas, because there's no one who's going to vet anyone's ideas far as what they want policy to be more than a libertarian, because we're generally skeptical. And so that at least you can figure out whether there's some angle you've missed, something you didn't think of in the ideas that you want proposed. Libertarians help keep everyone honest. We are the conscience of society. When society is deciding how to wield power, whether to wield power, and how to wield power, libertarians are a voice that should be heard, that should be acknowledged, that should exist. And hopefully after listening to this, you're much more open to having us libertarians, as part of the conversation. My name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Check out libertarian101.com as well. Have a great day and enjoy.